Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the last webinar in our series for the National Cooling Standards Initiative. My name is Cassandra Lovejoy. I'm co-director of the Center for Energy Poverty and Climate, and I'm just going to kick us off this afternoon and turn things over to the speakers pretty quickly because they're the ones that you want to hear from. So a quick kind of level setting of who we are and what we're doing here. The Center for Energy Poverty and Climate is a nonprofit organization that's focused on helping with the energy transition, specifically as it pertains to low-income households. And we are working with the Climate Works Foundation as well as the National Association for State Energy Officials on a project with the called the National Cooling Standards Initiative, where we're trying to take a look at helping low-income households adjust to rising temperatures and making sure that they have safe, comfortable homes to live in the summer months. This has kind of been a long project, about 2 or 3 years that we've been working on this. And it covers quite a wide range of topics as it pertains to low-income households, from energy efficiency to bill payment assistance. We've been talking about emergency shutoff protection, all kinds of different things. This session today is going to be talking about financing. So we've gone over kind of a lot of the different options that states have when they're thinking about addressing cooling needs for low-income households. And today we want to talk about how to take all of those funds that are at the federal and state, local level, at the utilities, and braid them all together to create something that is useful and valuable for low-income households, and it enables them to live in the safe homes that they need. So today we're going to start off with Jill Eichenhorst from the Washington State Department of Commerce, and she's the Solar Section Supervisor, which is a great title. I like the alliteration. And then we're going to turn it over after that to Leanne Kaplan, who's at the Communities First Fund, and she's the Infrastructure Alliance Partnerships and Program Manager. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Jill. We can see your screen, Jill. Go ahead.
Jill, I think you might be on mute.
Of course. I got everything right except for that. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Jill Eichenhorst. I'm the Solar Program Supervisor with Washington State Department of Commerce, and I'm here today to talk about what we call our No Wrong Doors funding opportunity. So this is a streamlined clean energy grant opportunity that we've piloted here in Washington over the past 6 to 9 months. So we thought this might be interesting when you're considering bringing together different funding sources and navigating procurement guidelines in particular, if you're making grants. And so excited to share that. This is an ongoing opportunity, and so we still have we're still working through some of the final pieces of this opportunity. And so we still have many lessons learned, but excited to share what we've done so far. So first of all, a little bit more about Commerce and our state energy office. So the energy division within Commerce is our Washington State Energy Office. So the Department of Commerce overall has a mission to strengthen communities. We have a broad portfolio of programs and services we provide in our agency. And I think critically, when we're talking about braiding funding sources, it's actually really helpful for us to have these connections across our agency, to connect with colleagues in housing or economic development or community services, to make sure that we are serving communities with their needs, whether they think about them as energy needs or not, and also addressing all of those related needs when people come to us with energy projects. And within the State Energy Office, we act as a catalyst to advance the transition to a clean and just energy future where everyone in Washington can thrive. So energy work in our state is guided by several state policies to eliminate the use of fossil fuels by 2050. So this will require deep decarbonization of key sectors where we emit the largest greenhouse gas emissions. So built environment, transportation, industry, and clean electricity generation. And we also recognize that communities will not feel the effects of climate change equally. So we aim to reduce economic, geographic, and environmental disparities. So communities hurt first and worst will be better equipped to transition to a clean energy future. And we have some landmark state policies that have been passed under our current administration, Governor Inslee, that advance these objectives. So the Clean Energy Transformation Act, the Climate Commitment Act, which critically is funding many of our programs now, and the Healthy Environment for All or HEAL Act, which focuses on environmental justice, and various other executive orders and policies that impact energy and environmental justice. And so while Washington is making significant strides towards reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, more work is needed, and this transformation requires investment. So in the last legislative session, the state authorized Commerce to administer close to $1 billion in funding, which will accelerate clean transportation, building decarbonization, grid modernization, innovation, and equitable clean energy deployment. And this $1 billion represents significant growth over the past several years. Our budget has just increased and increased, and the Climate Commitment Act is resulting in even more. And of course, the federal funding is on top of that. And so we're also bringing in infrastructure funds, IRA funds, and building on top of that. So we're seeing just a significant expansion in funding opportunities at both the state and federal level. And we're being asked to administer much of that. And so specifically the unit that I work in, the Energy Programs in Communities unit, I don't have the specific number for the biennium, but we're taking on a big portion of that funding. But we are one of many units within the energy division that administers funding. So we in EPIC, we call ourselves, design, develop, and implement initiatives that enable communities to be part of the clean energy transition. EPIC staff work closely with community advisors, policy experts, technical consultants to administer grant and assistance programs aimed at reducing energy burden for low-income communities. Specifically in the past, the current biennium that we're in right now, our funding was not only significant growth, but a lot of new different funding sources. And so we were looking at over 10 different funding sources that all had different focus. And so many of these were kind of specific budget provisos that have their own goals, legislative intent. And I think we found that as we're continuing to address climate change and continue with the clean energy transition, there's more and more of these kind of specific areas that we're seeing that need to be addressed and that need funding. But the downside of that is that we end up with a very complicated kind of maze of funding. That's what it feels like to communities and sometimes to myself as well. So we looked at this budget and the number of different opportunities we had, and we're just like, we need a new approach to to do this in a way that is administratively possible for us, and also that that is, something that communities can navigate. So we came up with what we're now calling our no wrong door approach. And so we took 9 of those funding streams. There are more, but we looked at 9 specifically that we felt could work together, and put them into 117 million 3 opportunities that are kind of all related. And those 3 opportunities are tailored to different communities in Washington. And all of these funds are actually state funds, but I think you could also do this approach to combine state and federal funds. And again, all of these are Climate Commitment Act funds in Washington. So our 3 funding opportunities, we split into tribal clean energy, community decarbonization, and general. The tribal clean energy was first, and that we had a $16 million target for funding there, and that it's an ongoing opportunity, so a rolling process. We have deadlines in April. We had our first deadline, one in July and one in September, and then we review the applications after each of those deadlines. And that was really critical for working with tribes, because we found that the timelines that tribes work on may not align with ours, and they're not able to change those, or they're not going to change those. And so we want to respect that, and especially respect them as sovereign governments to actually manage projects on the timeline that makes sense for them. And so by having this rolling process, we're able to get the funding out to projects, but also kind of allow that flexibility in the timeline. And also critically, I think the multiple deadlines means folks can reapply. So we had 13 million requested in our first deadline, the April deadline there. And we ended up funding 7 projects with 9.7 million. So we had some projects that we didn't end up funding, but they are able to reapply now. And then in our second opportunity, the community decarbonization, we just recently announced awards for this. This program is focused on those who will feel the effects of climate change first and worst. So projects that improve outcomes for communities that face inequitable risks from climate change, including energy burden and health. And then, so with this, we had a target of 67 million. We ended up with $162 million requested. And so we ended up funding 69 projects with about 70 million. So we actually went over our initial target there in order to fund more projects. And now we are currently evaluating the general solicitation for clean energy projects, which is open to all projects and applicant types from all over the state. So we have approximately 30.5 million available for this. Our goal here is to just use the rest of the funding and get that out there, whatever it ends up being. And so that we're currently evaluating. We got a very high level of interest for that. And we honestly need some more evaluators. So if anybody on this call is interested in reading some applications over the next couple of weeks, please reach out to me. But anyways, we're planning to make those awards by the end of July. And so the process here, or the 3 different rounds, aligns also with some requirements from the Climate Commitment Act source to have funding for different go to overburdened communities and tribes specifically. So it's somewhat aligned with like the Justice 40 at the federal level. And so by splitting out the different opportunities this way, we're able to ensure that we're meeting those targets. I think if I have anything more to say on this slide, so applicants are submitting one application for a range of funding opportunities here. So we have these 9 funding streams, but folks only need to submit one application for each of these opportunities. And then we take on the work of matching the applications to a funding source. So that saves the applicants time in weeding through complex administrative and bureaucratic language. It reduces the risk of error, especially for people applying to an opportunity that they're actually not eligible for. So if they may think they're eligible for something, and we determine they're not actually, we may still have another funding source that works for them. And then we can also just be more flexible in terms of making sure the funding is used up. So, you know, if one funding stream is less popular than others, we're able to look at overall, do we have more projects that actually fit within that than what they thought they were eligible for? And so we're able to be efficient in using up more of that funding. So this is a bit of a diagram to give you an idea of our matching process. Our goal was to strive for the most efficient allocation of funding by filling the 9 funding buckets, if you will, with the highest scoring projects. And so each of these funding sources is a state budget proviso. And so they each have their own, you know, requirements and guidelines, legislative intent. Some are more specific than others. One is literally one sentence. And so by like bringing them all together, each of those budget provisos, we can look at them across all of these different, we can look at each proposal across all these different budget provisos. And many of the projects are eligible for multiple of these funding sources due to those overlapping budget areas and legislative intent. And so those communities aren't having to apply for this source and this source and this source. We're able to do that matching. And so in a nutshell, our process is to collect proposals through a request for applications and online application. And we evaluated and scored proposals through a standardized tool. We had technical reviewers, subject matter experts, and community advisors that all contributed, and our scoring focused on both technical feasibility, management considerations, as well as equity and environmental justice. So we went through that evaluation process. Most of those criteria were considered across the entire portfolio. We had actually just one proviso that was really specific in saying what we needed to evaluate. And so with that one proviso, we had a few additional scoring categories. And with that one, we only considered that scoring when we were considering an application for that bucket. And so once we got through our entire evaluation process, we looked at the top ranked projects and allocated them to the funding source. We did receive more fundable projects than money was available, but not for all of the buckets. So for most funding buckets, projects had to receive a grade, if you will, of about 80% or higher to receive funding. But for some of the buckets that had more funding, were less popular, we lowered that to like 60% of the scoring. This is really critical. During this whole process, we got a supplemental budget that changed what we had available. So one program was significantly cut to where we basically had no funding available. And that was actually one of the most popular programs that people were applying for. And so this process actually allowed us to kind of redirect a lot of those applications to another bucket. So we still had significant oversubscription because of that. But, you know, some of those projects that were really high scoring, really great projects were still able to get redirected to another funding source. And so I think this process allowed us to kind of roll with some of those changes and be more flexible in our approach. That was, at least to me, a little bit of a surprise benefit of doing things this way, is that we were able to be flexible with those changes in the environment. And the bucketing or bringing in these different funding sources wasn't the only kind of new approach here. And I think actually by combining many of these, by combining these sources, we were able to do some additional things that, you know, if we had 10 different application processes out there at once, it would have been hard to do some of these things. And so for looking at community perspectives and collaboration, we actually started with a request for information and some feedback sessions. And we actually did that in a coordinated way, where we presented all of this information. We asked some questions that were relevant across the portfolio and asked people to give us feedback. And that was responsive to community feedback that we've gotten, that, you know, when we're going out and asking for feedback, we're asking for kind of the same feedback over and over again. And people just want to tell us once and want us to move forward with that. So by consolidating that request for information, that also helped us to reduce our ask of the community to provide us feedback. We also were able to translate some materials and provide interpretation services, which we have not done in the past. We're not able to accept applications not in English still, but we were able to do some of that feedback with translation and interpretation, and then also some of the information sessions for our grants. We were able to provide interpretation services. And so I think that also expanded the opportunity to learn about the funding source. We incorporated that feedback as much as possible into our request for applications. We were under very tight timeline here. So we do have additional things that we'll definitely consider for future iterations. And then we also had a community advisory committee, and I kind of alluded to this, and also a tribal advisory committee. So these were evaluators, paid evaluators with lived experience, and we had them actually evaluate the equity and environmental justice portions of the applications, and that impacted our funding recommendations. And we also had technical evaluators who looked at feasibility and timeline, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, things like that. So our community advisory committee didn't have to learn all that and know all of that. We were able to bring in both types of expertise. And then we also had an overall goal of reducing barriers to entry. So leveling the playing field by eliminating matching funds requirements for nearly all applicants. We've heard many, many times that that is a barrier for the least resource communities. We're able to reduce that in most cases. And we also built in flexibility with the eligible activities. So planning, permitting, design, construction were all eligible for this funding opportunity. Not every single funding source was able to fund all of those activities, but in many cases they were. And so we kept it as open as we possibly could. And then we had the flexibility to match those funding sources, and also the opportunity for people to resubmit between the rounds. If they didn't get funded in round 2, the community decarbonization round. We provided them feedback, and they were able to resubmit for the general solicitation. There was a very tight timeline. So I'm sure some folks, if they heard that, would say, well, we had like a week. So we did our best with the timeline that we had to give people that opportunity. We also, though, accepted what we call as-is applications. And so that allowed us or allowed communities to say, hey, we don't have any more time to put into this application. We didn't get funded, but can you please consider it still for the next round? And so we did get a number of those as-is applications to consider in the general round as well. Okay, I think I have some extra slides here, but there we go. That's all I have here. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions.
Thank you so much, Jill. I appreciate it. We're going to turn over to Leanne in just a second. We will be doing a Q and answer session at the end. So if you could hold your questions to the end if you want to ask them out loud. If you want to put it in the chat as you go, you're welcome to do that as well. And with that, it looks like Leanne's got her screen on, is still muted, but let's turn things over to Leanne. And I believe Lena is going to be running your slides. So let's get the slides up and get going.
Great, thank you, Lena. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. My name is Leanne Kaplan, and I am the Partnerships and Program Manager for Communities First. Today, I'm going to talk a bit about Communities First and what we do. Then I'm going to give a little bit of overview information about the Just and Clean Energy Future State Implementation Accelerator program that we just launched. And then I'm going to highlight some resources on federal funding that might be of interest to this group. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background about Communities First. Communities First is the largest alliance in the U.S. committed to centering racial and climate justice in new federal infrastructure funding. The Communities First Infrastructure Alliance includes more than 100 member organizations committed to the Communities First principles and centering low-wealth Black and Brown communities in the implementation of federal infrastructure funds. So the Alliance has monthly calls for information sharing between the federal government, NGOs, philanthropy, racial and environmental justice movement leaders, and communities. And we also have a Google group for the members of the Alliance to share information and different updates. Communities First was, next slide, please. Communities First was created in 2021 to center communities in the implementation of new federal infrastructure funding, including the American Rescue Plan, ARPA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act. The Biden-Harris administration has set a baseline through the Justice 40 initiative to deliver 40% of benefits of new federal investments to low-income and disadvantaged communities. We really see this from our perspective at Communities First as a Justice 100 moment. So how can we go beyond the goals, above and beyond the goals of Justice 40, and utilize the federal discretionary funding and the state and local formula funding to address areas of greatest need? Next slide, please. So Communities First's theory of change is that for decades, people of color and low-wealth individuals, particularly those living in frontline communities in the U.S., have disproportionately been negatively impacted by public infrastructure investment. There's a unique opportunity to address these challenges and embed racial equity, climate resilience, and social inclusion practices in the new massive federal public infrastructure investments. And we're particularly focused on how can we move from viewing this as a moment to a sustained movement, and especially focused on system change strategies. Next slide, please. Communities First is based on a set of foundational principles, the Communities First principles, which each organization has to sign on to become a member of the Communities First Infrastructure Alliance. These principles are based on years of work and organizing from the racial and environmental justice movement, as well as the solidarity economy. And we attempt to codify the lessons here. So the main principles are repairing past harm, responsiveness and accountability, people as infrastructure, centering community wisdom, self-determination, bridging integrative pathways, and proactive collaboration. Next slide, please. So these are just kind of a little bit more information about Communities First Alliance. The Alliance works with technical assistance providers, frontline communities, and community leaders to unlock the potential of the various federal funding opportunities. And we are focused on building a more just, equitable, and resilient communities. Next slide, please. Here are our 2024 focus areas. So they're practice, partnerships, policy and program implementation, power building and public accountability, and advancing project plans. Next slide, please. Last year, Communities First also conducted a series of regional convenings to bring together federal agency staff, state agency staff, philanthropy, and different communities in regions 1, 4, and 5. So we had convenings in Providence, Detroit, and Durham, North Carolina throughout the fall in 2023. Next slide, please. And finally, the last bit of background information is that Communities First is also a funder. So we have a rapid response fund, which is a movement fund. Sorry, we have a rapid response fund and a movement fund. These are both oriented for community-based organizations. We have gotten quite a range of requests for the funds, and the ones that we are focused on awarding and selecting for these are projects that are centering communities in this moment. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to give a little bit of overview information about the Just and Clean Energy Future State Implementation Accelerator that we just launched. We're going to be announcing the selected state cohort at the end of July. Next slide, please. The accelerator will support 3 to 5 states that are looking to stack and leverage key federal programs that invest in a just and clean energy future across various sectors. So we are really focused on supporting states that are committed to maximizing the benefits and impact of federal funding, prioritizing low-income and disadvantaged communities, especially frontline communities. Next slide, please. The intention of the accelerator is to support states to think about what is necessary to meet this unprecedented funding moment and to design implementation strategies to benefit communities for generations to come, and really looking at systems change strategies. Next slide, please. For the accelerator timeline, we are planning to select our final cohort in mid-July and announce the cohort at the end of July, with programming kicking off in August. The cohort is going to have the opportunity to meet with federal agencies and the White House in the end of August or early September. And then in September and October, we're hoping to partner with states to host something in each state to talk through implementation and bring people to the table together. And since we've had such a strong interest in the accelerator, we had 12 states apply for the cohort. We're planning to provide additional resources and 2 to 3 webinars with federal agencies for the states that were not selected. And we're working with the White House and the federal agencies to provide customized technical assistance support to the finalized cohort based on what their needs are through the interview process. Next slide, please. So we had some questions about what an ideal partnership might look like for the accelerator. So an example collaborative partnership here might be something that a state is working with multiple agencies and community-based organizations in a particular place to try to use different investments together to have a transformative impact. So for example, a state might already have its CPRG planning awards, and they're thinking about how can they connect with the GGRF Solar for All funding and the LIDAC analysis they've already done for their CPRG. And then they're also thinking about where is the DOT going to locate the electric vehicle infrastructure, chargers, and all of those pieces together. And how can you stack each of these different programs to really have a transformative impact in a particular place? Next slide, please. So here are some examples of target programs for the accelerator across sectors. So as I mentioned, we're going to be working with the federal agencies and our technical assistance partners to provide tailored TA to the states selected for the final cohort based on the needs of each state. Next slide, please. So now I'll quickly go through some resources on federal funding that might be of interest to the group. Next slide, please. So during Infrastructure Week in May this year, the Biden-Harris administration just released new state-by-state fact sheets. They spotlight the investments from infrastructure investment laws in all 50 states, the territories, and Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. The White House also released during Infrastructure Week an updated map showcasing the more than 56,000 projects and awards funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law that are identified or now underway. Next slide, please. And so the administration's efforts that bring together infrastructure funding can be found on build.gov. So this is really where you want to go to look for resources on funding awards, where there are private sector investments, and other kind of interactive data maps. Next slide, please. The Inflation Reduction Act funding information maps are on cleanenergy.gov. This is another mapping site that has been updated as of Infrastructure Week 2024. Next slide, please. And invest.gov is another resource that brings together all of the most recent funding, both from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Next slide, please. So just to quickly summarize, the three most important websites with regards to the federal infrastructure funding are invest.gov, build.gov, and cleanenergy.gov. Next slide, please. So while these are the White House resources that I showed previously, many of the agencies have also come together through the Thriving Communities Network, which includes more than 9 federal agencies. And I'm going to focus on the DOE resources given the cohort's work here. Next slide. So here are the agencies participating in the Federal Interagency Thriving Communities Network. All of the agencies have committed to shared goals, including scale for impact, build community wealth, center the power of community, meet areas of greatest need, expand access and participation, and diversify knowledge. Next slide, please. I also want to quickly share some of the information on Department of Energy technical assistance, community recipients, and resources in case you all are not aware of these technical assistance programs, and for you to be able to share with your colleagues and partners. Next slide, please. So DOE has several place-based support programs. This includes the Clean Cities Coalition, the Local Energy Action Program, LEAP, and the Priority Energy Communities. So there are maps here. Next slide. Another key office at DOE is the Office of State and Community Energy Programs. So they have a variety of resources for states, including the State and Local Solution Center and the Office of Community Engagement. Next slide, please. So here are a few of the resources that SCEP is providing to states, including support for the setting up revolving loan funds, weather-resistant program resources, and different lead tools that they've created. Next slide, please. So some of the key programs that SCEP manages include the weatherization program and the home energy rebates program. Could we go back to the previous slide real quick? So this is information on the weatherization assistance program. Next slide, please. And then here's information on the home energy rebates program. And one thing I want to emphasize is that a lot of the programs from the federal level have been taken from the viewpoint of looking at homeowners. And so it's also critical to keep in mind renters when we're thinking about cooling and housing options. If there's renters, their awareness of programs like LIHEP, LIHEAP, and WAP are critical. And we also don't think about seniors usually. So it's important to think about, when we're thinking about cooling, to think about from a generational perspective and a resource perspective, not just from an income perspective. So I just wanted to add that little kind of nuance there, and emphasize that there's a lot of difference between single family homes, what might be a 4-unit building and what is a 25-unit building. And a lot of times there's really a gap in the approach between single family homes and then getting to that 16-family unit or 24-unit building. So when you're thinking about scale, we want to think about kind of managing these gaps, and then also what are the other roles that states can play in these programs. So thinking about community resource centers and being able to work with community-based advocates to be part of the solution in the cooling centers. Next slide, please. Finally, for some partners, we recognize that grants are the priority, but low interest loans from the government also offer additional capital for consideration. So while DOE has their revolving loan fund, the most recent greenhouse gas reduction fund could also be a source for consideration. So we can provide some links to some of the new resources that DOE has rolled out about the revolving loan fund. They've just created a revolving loan fund resource library, as well as kind of a multi-part 4-step series on how to learn more about the revolving loan technical assistance program. Next slide, please. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll drop my email into the chat and look forward to any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Leanne. Before we open it up to Q&A, I'm going to turn things over to Jasmine at NASIO just for a minute. She's going to go over a couple of one additional program and talk a little bit about what they're doing over at NASIO. Go ahead, Jasmine.
So much, Cass and Leanne and Jill, for your great presentations. Jill, I think I put in the chat a follow-up question just for my own edification, so can jump to that later. But Leanne, really appreciate you teeing up a lot of the federal funding that our state energy office members might be thinking about already. In case we have a mix of folks in the audience here, NASIO and CEPC, so the National Association of State Energy Officials, and the Center for Climate Poverty and Climate have been working together on a resource that actually was just published, taking best practices from state energy offices to kind of describe the key role that state energy offices and their partners at state agencies can play to ensure that communities and households can access affordable cooling solutions regardless of income and other barriers, and thus kicked off this 4-part webinar series. If you've tuned in to our past sessions, and now is kind of culminating in this discussion of like, okay, what comes next? How can states and their partners actually go about funding and financing these solutions? So in the midst of that the rollout of this webinar series, we were also able to recently publish this written resource that I'll drop a link to in the chat, a paper called Beating the Heat: Recommendations and Considerations for States to Support Cost-Effective Residential Cooling, where we do kind of capture some of the federal funding opportunities that Leanne had teed up for us, kind of encourage state energy offices to refer to best practices from their peer state energy offices, capture kind of comprehensive program portfolios for folks to really understand all the various facets that of program approaches that states can take, ranging from kind of taking in energy efficiency first approach to developing workforce programs to support a qualified network of contractors and installers for various systems, to even just supporting research and development of new cooling technologies that might also pair with existing heating and cooling solutions. So kind of with all that, one item I'll tack on perhaps to Leanne's mention of the Weatherization Assistance Program, which is, an annual program that has been run out of the Office of State and Community Energy Programs, is a competitive opportunity called the Weatherization Innovation Grants. And this is also an annual program, one that we kind of highlighted in a recent separate NASIO working group focused on manufactured housing, actually, but has broad implications for the residential sector more broadly, where these weatherization assistance program innovation grants are available to WAP grantees, subgrantees, any nonprofit organizations that are trying to go above and beyond the scope of the WAP formula program, which is kind of within the scope of what we discuss within the cooling report as well, where it's not just a matter of conducting weatherization measures and improvements, but also kind of looking at ways to then integrate highly efficient cooling technologies, perhaps in the form of heat pumps into homes as well. So we were able to highlight a bunch of great examples awarded through the 2023 program year, and I'll just drop a link in the chat here for anyone interested in learning more about the ongoing awards that will be available every year. So more on the weatherization innovation grants can be found at this link. But yes, I want to thank everybody for our panelists for their presentations today, and kind of toss it back to maybe Jill first to get to an initial question I'd put in the chat. I think it's great to discuss kind of the State Energy Office role in just building capacity for the communities that will end up needing to apply for these funds. So I was curious to just understand specifically what 9 funds you were referring to in that slide. And then from there, welcome all other questions from any other participants today.
Yes, I had time to prepare, so I would not be able to name them all if I didn't have a list in front of me. So first of all, the one thing we did with this opportunity was to kind of insulate the applicants from all of the vagaries and details of like the budgeting process. And so we call these funding categories, and the names might differ a little bit from what I'm about to read to you, and I'll put a link in the chat if anyone just wants to learn more about the program, and you could look at the RFA specifically if you want to. So the categories, in the capital budget, we had energy retrofits and solar power for public buildings. And specifically the solar portion of that funding. Clean energy, under the Clean Energy Fund program, we have two different provisos: the tribal clean energy grants and grid integration and innovation. Then we had hard to decarbonize sector and economic development grants. Hard to decarbonize sectors, I think that one's actually called. Large scale solar innovation projects, community solar resilience hubs, and community solar. So that's all the capital budget. And then under operating, we have dual use solar pilot grants and clean energy siting and permitting grants.
Cool, thank you, Jill. Yeah, and I imagine if it's kind of hard to keep track of as a state level administrator, it's even harder as like your average layperson. So I think what you all are piloting over it in Washington State is a really valuable program approach for other states to consider.
I have a question for Leanne. It sounds like you said the incubator is going to have 3 to 5 states that you're going to be working with in the first round. Is there going to be an opportunity for states that either aren't selected or are interested in kind of following along and seeing how this all goes to participate or to be engaged?
Yeah, we're actually planning to do a couple webinars with the federal agencies that will be open to all of the states that applied. And we're also considering inviting all the states to some of the site visits with federal agencies in DC in the late summer. That's to be confirmed, but we're also planning to make all of the resources that we develop with the federal agencies, like, slide decks and things like that, are going to be completely publicly open, and we're going to put them on our website.
Great. I'm very excited to see where it goes. That's a very challenging task that you guys have taken on, but it's
Yeah.
really needed. So I'm very excited to see how that goes.
Thank you.
Jill, I have a question for you. For the, am I understanding that the groups that are applying, it's not individuals, right? It's mostly development projects that would be applying. And is there kind of a one-stop shop, or is it wherever they come in, they get kind of funneled into these three options?
Yeah, so yes, it's not individuals, and it's really not very residentially focused. There's a few potential opportunities for residential, but more commercial, especially with solar, utility scale even, and then yeah, other other projects, transit agency, fueling project, for example. So really different things there. And people can come in any of those three doors, and then we slotted them to like specific funding sources. But if somebody applied for the tribal funding source who wasn't an eligible tribal applicant, they would not have been able to be considered. That didn't happen, fortunately. But also, as I mentioned, we did end up kind of allowing people to reapply in the general round. And so there was also a sequence where folks could, if they happen to come in one of the wrong door, I guess, we still allowed them to, there were still opportunities for them to be considered. And so by having that general, very open opportunity last, that allows us to like shuffle people to that as needed. And also I should say tribes are eligible for any of the three, and we did get tribes applying for any of the three. But we did encourage them to go towards the tribal funding because it's a tailored opportunity focused on tribes, tribal evaluators, and we also had one funding source, tribal clean energy grants. That was kind of the most broad and exclusive for tribes. So we wanted to funnel people towards that opportunity as much as possible.
Thank you. If anyone has any questions from the group, again, you're allowed to welcome to put it in the chat. You can also raise your hand if you want to voice your question out loud. But we'll kind of continue here as moderators until we either exhaust ourselves or get some questions from the group. And I just absolutely blanked on the next question that I was going to ask Jill. Give me just a second. Oh, so you said that right now it's predominantly state funds. Are there going to be opportunities to either start including some of the federal dollars that have been coming out as those programs get developed and rolled out, or other opportunities to change or expand the what's included in the buckets and how
Yeah. So at one point we were considering putting our federal 401(d) funds, or federal grid funds is what we're calling those now. So putting that into the bucket as well. We determined, that was a complicated decision to leave that one out, but in particular because I believe DOE has to like review those again or approve them. So just like a different funding process there. So I think it does depend a little bit on the federal source, but there's no reason not to include federal's funds as well. And as far as next going forward, I think one thing that's a possibility is we get, say, somebody applying for grid integration and innovation who is a good fit for the 401(o)(1)D. In that case, we may be able to move them to that opportunity as well. I think this was kind of a new approach, and we're getting to, we've made some awards. We're still working on our last round here and making those awards. So I think following that, we're going to spend some time to kind of regroup and debrief and decide, how we want to continue working with this approach in the future. I do think it has been successful in many ways. And so I see us, continuing to use similar approaches for various funding sources as they are available. And I guess one other thing that we'd really like to do better is integrating with federal tax credits. And so that has been a challenge. I mentioned that we eliminated match funding requirements for most of these. Some people still are planning to apply and get federal tax credits for their projects, but it's not required at all. And what we've learned is that many folks they need bridge funding. Basically, they don't have cash up front to wait for reimbursement for tax credits. And so we need a financing option in place. And I would very much like to, in my perfect world, we would have an opportunity people can apply for, get grant funding, and also get considered for financing and have a financing opportunity in that same application, and then use that to allow them to leverage the federal tax credit.
Great, thank you. Leanne, I was wondering if you could help us by adding to the chat some additional resources particularly about the incubator and the other projects that might be used to state energy officials and state energy offices.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and how we can kind of continue the conversation. I saw that you also dropped your email in.
Yeah, here's the link to more information about the accelerator.
Right. Sorry, I keep calling it an incubator.
No, that's okay. And then I'm also going to share the slides, but I have kind of linked in here a lot of the resources that I clicked through. So some of the federal funding resources and some of the resources from SCEP and the different DOE offices. So I can pull out those individual links and send them to you all.
Great. Okay. All right. Do we have any other questions from the group? Okay. Well, if not, thank you so much, Jill and Leanne, for joining us today, and Jasmine as well, to talk about this issue and to share the resources that you guys are developing. It's really exciting to see, some of the ways that folks are trying to braid these funds, trying to make it easy for both on the residential level, households and families, and on the commercial level, developers and folks trying to build new infrastructure to be able to access these complicated, convoluted, many sources of funding and to make it all make sense. And so we hope to continue following your work, and we appreciate you being able to join us today. And thanks to everyone who was able to join on the call as well.
Thank you, Cass. Thanks all.